There are many things a person can do to protect themselves from the fairies. By way of precaution, you can carry holy water or a piece of iron around with you in a pocket, or if you find yourself in a sticky situation or led astray, you can always turn your coat inside out. But protecting ourselves against a fairy wind, well, that's near impossible. Hi, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. In his book, Meeting the Other Crowd, Irish storyteller and author Eddie Lenihan shares an insightful tale of the fairy wind, where a mother and son were out working very hard on a field of loose hay. It had been shaken out and they were working on gathering it in, using only forks and rakes. Very hard work, to be fair, when all of a sudden a huge gust of wind blew up and whooshed all the hay right through the gate and right where it needed to be. Well, the mother told her son in all earnestness that it had been the fairies doing. So, was this an act of fairy kindness? Did the fairies witness the man and his mother working very hard and decide to give them a hand? Well, Mr. Lenihan visited the farm where this event took place, and he said there is no possibility that any ordinary gust of wind could have moved that amount of hay it contained to the place he indicated. Tales of a fairy wind bringing help or good fortune are uncommon, though. In general, the sight of a fairy wind is met with dread, as it's believed that this is one method the fairy folk use to move from place to place, and, well, as you would expect, they do not take kindly to humans getting in their way. There was a man in this district who insisted on building his new house in a place which was known by the old people of the district to be on a fairy path. They warned him against building his cottage there, but he went and did it anyway. And by, one evening, soon after he began living there, a mighty blast of a fairy wind appeared suddenly and knocked him over. As it happened, he was holding a lighted torch, and, assisted by the sudden blast of wind, the thatch set ablaze, and within minutes the whole dwelling was destroyed. Of course, it's not uncommon for people to see small whirlwinds throughout the countryside, sweeping up dust and flowers, and there was once a time when it was accepted that this sight was a warning that the fairy were about. So it was, people became terribly anxious at the sight of a column of hay rising up at one end of a field, while the wind at the other end of the field was perfectly still, because it meant that something terrible could be about to happen. One day I was going over the fields near Colleen, and it was the quietest day of summer that you ever did see. And all of a sudden I heard a great noise like thunder, and a blast of wind passed by me, so strong it laid the thistles low. And then it was all quiet again. It might be that they were changing, for they do move from place to place. Now, I think you'll find this interesting. An approaching fairy wind is said to be preceded by a loud humming noise, like the sound of thousands of bees. This noise is caused by the fairy host within the wind, but they are not always alone. Often, a fairy wind would also contain trapped souls, crops, animals, and of course, any unfortunate human who was pulled into the wind as it passed. Imagine a moment just how terrifying that sound would be. You might be completely exposed while out working in the fields with that whirlwind approaching you, or out at night taking a shortcut home across the fields with no street lights, no torch or smartphone to light your way, only the moon to guide you, and then you hear that noise, the fierce whish and the familiar buzzing of the fairy wind. It must have been terrifying. There are accounts of the fairy wind ripping the roof clean off a family's house and of causing injury to humans and animals, but particularly to their eyes. That's a curious one, isn't it? But the sudden appearance of a fairy wind can also cause unexpected illness, or even worse. There is a place in Kerry called Causeway, and it is full of ghost stories and folklore. My father was born there. Well, some years ago, there was a man living there with his wife and children. He owned a farm which was some distance from his house, and one day he went out to draw a load of hay from it. When he was coming home, sitting on top of the hay, all of a sudden, a gust of wind, a fairy blast, blew the cap off his head. Well, he got home safely and told his family what had happened, but he fell sick the next day and died shortly afterwards. And the people were certain that the fairy wind had been the cause of his death. His cap was never found. It is long believed that the fairies lay a claim to the land where they dwell or favour, and not surprisingly, this is found to be most common on land within and surrounding ring forts. So it follows that they would form an opinion of the people living on or near that land. This story was shared by Sean Doyle in 1937 and was told to him by his own grandfather. It happened in around 1840 in a place called Monkstown in County Cork. An old woman went picking sticks, as was her custom, for to boil the skillet. In the corner of the field near where she was working stood a big hawthorn bush, or as they called it, a thorny bush. Well, her eyes near stood in her head with fright, for with one glance she saw that on almost every thorn there was stuck paper. On drawing closer, she discovered that it was paper money. Well, the woman was afraid to touch it because she knew it surely belonged to the fairies, so she ran home in haste. She soon told the neighbours about it, and so it followed. The news spread like wildfire. Word soon reached the ears of the farmer who owned the land where the hawthorn bush stood, you see, and he went to the spot and claimed the money as his because it was found on his land. The old people say that the money was blown onto the bush by a fairy wind. Fairies also consider any crop which is grown on their favoured lands to be theirs, and who could argue with that? And from time to time they raise up a mighty fairy wind for to claim their crop. Take a look at this account, which was recorded in County Limerick in Ireland. There was a farmer who had a lot of mowing to do, and being a full moon, he said he would break into another field of hay before he went to bed. Well, he started off by mowing in a meadow that had a fort in it, and after a while, he noticed that 6 other mowers were falling in behind him. He never saw them coming, but heard the cutting behind him. When he turned to see what it was, he saw the 6 men behind him, and all keeping time with his own stroke. So he cut away. They were making short work of the meadow until they came to a stream that was running through the middle of it. One of the men said to him that they couldn't cross the running water, but that he should jump across it himself and leave his scythe behind him. So this he did and went home. In the morning, he found the meadow cut and the hay stacked in the field. But the next day, a fairy wind rose up suddenly and swept the hay away. The fairies played their part in cutting the hay, you see, but they decided to take it away too. So what should you do if you see or hear a fairy wind approaching? Well, somewhere along the line, it was decided that it would be a good idea to throw a sharp item into a fairy wind, which seems awfully risky to me because there are instances where people have flung a sharp item, like a fork, into a passing fairy wind, only to hear a cry or a pained moan emanate from within the wind. Well, this was enough to convince some people that there were indeed living creatures of some form within the fairy wind. But the person doing the throwing of the sharp object was, at the moment of throwing, supposed to say, "May my misfortune go with you." Well, I would wager that their misfortune was just beginning. You wouldn't catch me throwing a sharp object into a fairy wind, but there you go. But another custom, a far more sensible approach, I think, is that people would take off their hats and say, "God bless them," to the fairy wind as it passed. But that's not all. Here's another custom. Take a look at this one. A group of men were working in a field in Cam. A fairy wind came and the men heard a jumble of voices, laughing and talking, intermingled with groans and shouts coming from within the wind. One man took a fist of grass and threw it with the fairy wind, saying, "Carry this instead of me." This was a custom, you see, and was done so that the fairy wind would do them no harm. But when the wind settled, it was discovered there was a boy gone with it. The following night, the boy's father was out looking for his son, and as he passed by a fort, he heard fairy music. He gathered up his courage, went into the fort, and found his boy. Even if the passing fairy wind didn't suck you up into itself and to the mercy of the fairies, it could cause serious injury. Is it any surprise then that folk living on the land or in farming communities crossed themselves when they saw the fairy wind coming? So remember, if you find yourself in the line of an approaching fairy wind, lay down flat on the ground or cross yourself or shout God bless them or throw grass into the whirling wind. But please don't throw an object into the wind, particularly a sharp object, just in case. If you like my videos, please consider supporting me via YouTube memberships or becoming a patron. An enormous amount of time and resources and research and love goes into each and every video, and your support will mean that I can continue creating new videos every single week. Details of how you can support the channel are in the notes below. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio.